welcome to the Premier League Proven Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff, with my co-host and brother, Kevin, and today we are going to go over all of the craziness that's gone on in the Premier League this year, everything that you need to know to stay up to date with the league, and how our predictions and things that have surprised us as the league is played out. Because sports, if they're one thing, they are always unpredictable. And I think the first thing that's really interesting this year, well, not interesting, but kind of it's it's cast a shadow over, I think, the entire game. Not unlike, I think, the NFL in some ways, the NBA in some ways, but it's the refereeing crisis. And it's not just refereeing, it's almost a VAR crisis. But I think more than that, it's also just a refereeing crisis because VAR is just technology that is used by people, humans, and referees that already weren't necessarily the best, but at the same time kind of were the best in the world. You know, it's kind of this interesting cycles where everyone thinks that their league's referees are always the worst, and yet when the NFL brought in their replacement refs, all these types of things, and when you go down and they bring up a championship ref into the Premier League for a week or two, you see that there actually still are levels to how bad you can be at refereeing.
It's almost like it's a hard job, and hashtag robo-umps. I mean, why stop there? Let's get robo players in, and maybe you can give me a controller and I can play the game myself. So I think that might be the future of where league should go.
Yeah, and like you said, all the sports, I think baseball also has a subjective element as well, but every sport essentially has such a subjective rule set, and they ask the referees as the athletes get more and more competitive, as the scrutiny on every call becomes more and more, as we have better camera angles, more higher definition, better slow-mo. All of these things make it so that the mistakes that I think tons of people accepted in the past as mistakes, the hand of God goal in Maradona is one of the most famous goals of all time, was just a blatant handball. The fact that that can just happen in a World Cup game, like obviously refereeing has always been in some ways pretty suspect, and it's just because of how difficult it is to referee the game. But VAR, I think, has highlighted that, because the one thing VAR has done, it has changed our expectations for what we are expecting the referees to be in soccer.
And like you said, it's still humans making decisions, even if they have it at a million different angles, if they have slow-mos. There's subjectivity to all of these decisions, and you're just not always going to get it right. So I think it's a really valid point, like you're saying. People just have a lower tolerance in what's a bad call. But overall, it's probably referees are making better decisions than what there were in the past. So it's always good to take that with a grain of salt whenever you hear this referee crisis. I think another thing that you've kind of talked about before on this show is how much of a punching bag it is to talk about referees. Anytime there's a close game or a game that goes one way or unexpected way, like the easiest thing to do as a pundit is just to say, I can't believe they blew this call. I mean, perfect example is going to be Spurs City this last week, and they kind of botched an advantage call, and City fans are now like saying, I can't believe that referee took 2 points away from us. City were going to win that game. When in reality, Jack Grealish had 3 defenders around him at the 50. It wasn't exactly like this was a ball that was going into the net and they blew it dead. So it's just something easy for players and coaches and pundits to kind of glob onto. But one of the things that I've kind of been disappointed by is, speaking of that same game, is I thought referees this year, and I thought the PGMOL was focusing on making sure that players weren't abusing referees in the game. You should see some of the stills of Erling Haaland freaking out at the referee at the end of the game. He looks like a child throwing a temper tantrum. And
it's not just City that does this. Every single team does this. Like every single game, just surrounding the refs, going nuts. And they've kind of done it with the obvious yellow card. Asking for the yellow card, they'll give you a yellow card, and kicking the ball away, but you can still get away with kind of abusing the refs. They've tried to make it so that only the captains can kind of talk, which I think kind of works sometimes, but yeah, they're never really consistent with these things. And when they implement a new kind of standard for these types of new ways to, try to prevent dissent and things, it seems like it only lasts a few months at best.
Yeah, it's like any kind of authority, right? It's kind of a thin veil of what real authority is. And if you start chipping away at that, and if you start letting players, verbally abuse referees or really get in their face or, even threaten them in any kind of way, like you really lose sight of that. You kind of lose that air of authority and, the game is worse off after that.
And it is interesting, the actual authority of the referees. Like, do you think that there's been a significant impact on how players are kind of reacting because there's so much discourse now about how bad the referees have been? Do you think that kind of encourages players and coaches to kind of focus on this because they know that that's an avenue towards where everyone else will nod their head and say, yeah, the refs are terrible.
Yeah, I think so. And I think now that you get more scrutiny, I think there was a time where, even if it was a bad call, the call was the call and you kind of moved on with it. But now you can get on social media, see, 60 different replay angles of this event. And then you kind of feel validated. You feel like, obviously, look, he made this mistake. And the other thing is, you've said it before, all of these guys are humans. Like in some way, having someone yell at you is going to influence your decision, even at the tiniest margin or fraction. It still does. So if they're not going to give yellow cards, what's the downside of, yelling or accosting the referee?
Yeah, and just to jump back into what I was mentioning before, where I think VAR has changed our expectations. VAR being extremely interventionalist, especially this season, but also I think for large parts of last season, in that they are going back and erasing goals for small stuff. They are going and awarding goals for small fouls. They are influencing the outcome of games, whether you think those are the right calls or not, very frequently. And a penalty in soccer, this is part of the problem, is that VAR is awarding penalties, which have about an 80 to 90% chance of going in. And in a game where there's only 3, 4 goals, you're literally awarding 1/3 or 1/4 of the points in a game. It's like a referee automatically awarding 2 touchdowns in football or like 40 points in basketball. Like it's truly like on one foul call. Like that, the swings are absolutely monumental. They're huge. They completely change the individual games and therefore change entire seasons, careers, all these types of things. And the fact that they're doing it with a kind of heavy hand in terms of they're intervening on small decisions means that there will always be another 5 small decisions that could have gone either way in every game. So now that you've basically opened the doors and said, this type of small foul or this type of where it might be a foul, but are you quote unquote re-refereeing the game where, it's probably a foul, but it's not it's not a foul that every single person down at the pub would agree is a foul, but maybe like 60% of them would. Should that be overturned? Because if you start overturning those fouls, there are plenty of those things that get missed in a game, especially in the box, right? Where people are grabbing hold of each other all the time. Handballs are extremely subjective. Red cards where you're kind of going in with your studs on this guy, and sometimes that looks worse than it is. And if they dodge it, should it still be a red? Like all of these things are so subjective and can go either way that when you start overturning calls and changing games, everybody starts asking in the future, well, you did this on this game. Now look at this somewhat similar thing that you just ignored here. And it kind of makes a mockery of the entire refereeing process.
I think that's such a good point on just the way soccer is designed. And like you've said before, it's so unique to every other sport where you're just giving, really, really changing the expected outcome of the game. And I'd even take it a step further with the red cards. It doesn't just influence that game, it influences potentially the next 3 games. So it's like a 4-game swing. I mean, a great example of this is, Christian Romero for Spurs getting sent off. Now, of course, he probably should have been sent off earlier in that match, but he basically cleared a ball in his own box and followed through with the studs. It took viewing it for 2 minutes to determine if it was a red card or if it was a yellow card. Well, now it ended up being a red card and Spurs go down a man in that game. And then they're also without their best center back for 3 more games. So, like, that VAR decision has potentially cost, Spurs who knows how many points at the end of the year. So it's crazy how much that really influences the season.
And I think, to me, my immediate thoughts of how you could kind of change that, there's two ways. Number one is to kind of become less interventionist, and I think everybody kind of would like that because people don't really want to, especially in the stadiums. All it shows is like a VAR thing. On TV, we can watch the replays, but you can't see those replays in the stadium. So it really does negatively affect the stadium culture and kind of the energy in the stadium to just sit there for a minute and a half while they kind of just keep replaying things that you can't tell what's going on or what's likely to happen. My first thought would be just become less interventionist. Spend 10 seconds. If you can't figure out that something is a red card or a penalty within 1 to 2 views of it, just move on. It'll take the delays out, and it'll make it so that people don't expect every little thing to become a penalty, start questioning the referees why this small thing became a penalty, but that small thing didn't. Just say this is super obvious, which I think is what the intent was originally supposed to be. If this is super obvious, then just change it. And there shouldn't be that many of those super obvious moments. And if you can try to at least build consistency in that way, I think people will accept it more. They still probably won't accept it very well. But the second way, and probably the more effective way, is do it exactly like they did in the World Cup. And people say, oh, this was great in the World Cup. Do you know why I think it went well in the World Cup?
Human rights violations.
Because they didn't show you one single goddamn replay. So no fan could even see what happened. They would just say VAR check, VAR complete. They'd never show you the replay. And you know what that means? It means that nobody can even tell if there was a foul in the first place, and so there's nothing to complain about. And you could say that that's underhanded and all this stuff, and it kind of is. But if it makes it so it's very difficult to... People love the way that seemed to work in the World Cup, just not being able to see a ton of exhaustive replays. And if you start letting people scrutinize every little detail, you could argue that's better for the fans, and I think it kind of is, but it also makes it harder for the referees to adjudicate because now they're reacting to the scrutiny that they're getting based on all these calls. And they know that they're under pressure, and the way that they call games reflects that. And it means they spend 3 minutes to make a decision on a game that's only 90 minutes long. It's crazy. Like, people are sitting around for like 2 minutes while they're trying to draw lines because they're just so scared of making a mistake.
One last thing too, it's been pretty crazy that the PGMOL has been putting together shows after the week to kind of explain calls, and it's just like the self-gratifying team of just basically they get one head ref on there. I think one time it was Michael Owen asking these softball questions, only showing decisions that were...
And now they have Howard Webb running the whole thing, who used to be kind of the number one referee in England for a long time.
But basically on the show, they were saying, like, yeah, they're showing only the instances where VAR obviously got very, obvious errors correct. And there's like, yep, look, great process. Good check, boys. It all looked great. And to me, that just, I don't know, something about that is wrong. Having, another show based off of controversial decisions. Like, I'm just saying it's like a bad incentive system for it. And also not having the consistency of releasing the audio. It's only when managers kind of get on their soapboxes and go into every interview and complain about it and then get fined about complaining about it. But then they get their way and the audio gets released. So it's like, it's just refereeing crisis is the right way to describe it because it is just insane right now. And it just seems like the referee association has kind of lost the plot a little bit.
I do blame them, mostly. And then I think the frenzy that surrounds it just makes their job way harder to do. So I don't know. There's a few ways they can try to fix it, but I think if they just step back a little bit, say, look, we are just gonna we're basically not here. For offsides decisions, we can do all this offside stuff, but other than offside stuff, if it's an obvious red, we'll give it. If it's an obvious pen, we'll give it. Otherwise, you won't even hear of us. And I think that's probably the best way. But we'll see, kind of how they change things. They, for whatever... In soccer, because they're individual federations, the English refereeing, this is also, I think, a major problem is that English refereeing is different than Champions League refereeing, and they give handball for every single thing in the Champions League. Literally, an accidental handball that just somebody just kick blasted into your arm, given every time in the Champions League, and it kind of makes a mockery of the Champions League, if I'm being honest. I hate that. I cannot stand it. And if you think handball is bad in the Premier League, it is 10 times worse in the Champions League. And the fact that players kind of have to go midweek changing the rule sets that they're playing by is also just kind of crazy. But anyway, that's enough talk about the referees. We hear enough from them.
Are we the problem? Are we the media that is inciting this referee crisis?
Yeah, we are big media here, and we are very widely listened to, have a huge global audience. And the other big thing that you cannot ever get away from is also gambling. And whatever sport you're in, gambling seems to have taken over everything, and it seems to have started to affect some players as well.
Yeah, if you're probably listening to this podcast, you're probably the demographic that does the occasional sports betting, sports gambling, unlike ourselves. But it's not great if you're betting on things that you can influence. It's just more or less insider trading, but sports insider trading. And so something we've seen already this year, the beginning of the year, Ivan Toney, a great striker who had a phenomenal year last year with Brentford, got his 8-month ban from the Premier League because of gambling and betting on soccer. So Brentford has definitely felt the repercussions of that. They've not been as effective as they were last year.
Yeah, and he's an irreplaceable type of player up top and scores goals and is, probably their best player.
Yeah, it's crazy too. He was in the conversation for call-ups to England, and that's always really tough to do if you're not on quote unquote one of the big 6 or 7 teams to kind of crack into the national team. And then some other guys that we've kind of seen get bans here is going to be someone that I spoke really highly of at the beginning of this season, and that's going to be Tonali, a phenomenal young midfielder that Newcastle had and signed over the summer. Well, when he was in Italy, he was actually betting on illegal, like I don't know if they're a mafia run, but basically not legal sports books. And he was placing a lot of bets and apparently influencing other players to make bets on those different websites. So I completely get it. The guy seems like he might have some sort of gambling addiction issue. So really hope he does get help with all of that. But in the meantime, he really has hurt Newcastle because, they're fighting a war on a couple different fronts with domestic cups, Champions League, and the league, and they've been kind of running into their own injury crisis. So having someone that is out for the entire season or for the majority of the season really, really hurts.
Yeah, and obviously to all the professional players that listen to this podcast, just don't bet on your own sports or really any sports in general. You'll have enough money at the end when you retire that you can bet all you want then. But I think all the leagues do have to be very careful about protecting the integrity of these sports, especially with how prevalent gambling is becoming. But anyway, the last piece of housekeeping I think we really need to address is monumental news within the Premier League that could potentially send rippling effects out through the entire Premier League now and, for years to come. And that is the Everton point deduction that they suffered. And they were docked 10 points. So what that means is literally they have the same number of wins. You get 3 for a win, you get 1 for a tie. And the Premier League essentially said, whatever your point total is at the end of the year, we're going to take away 10, and that's where you're going to be. And if that relegates you, then that relegates you. So be it. And points deductions are not an uncommon thing in Premier League soccer or really any league, which is, I think, completely unheard of for an American sports listener. Like the fact that a league would vacate wins from an NFL team or a basketball team or a baseball team is that would literally just cause the biggest meltdown of all time. The worst thing that they do is fine you and take draft picks in the Premier League. And that's mostly because the owners would never let that happen to their teams. And the owners really run those leagues, whereas the Premier League is not quite as owner driven in the same sense. The Premier League is almost more important or above the owners rather than the kind of oligarchy that are American ownership groups, where, Roger Goodell is essentially working as an employee of the owners. The same is not necessarily true of the Premier League and really any sports league. So if you do the crime, you do the point deduction. I think that's how the saying goes. So, yeah, only 6 teams have ever had points deducted in the English top flight. And it's kind of really changing the entire season.
Yeah, it's also something to remember that these are charges that were filed against Everton in the 21-22 season. And just to kind of take you back to where we were in that time, I mean, these are going to be COVID times still. So this made a huge impact in the finances of a lot of clubs. And really what ended up happening to Everton is they went about 20 million pounds over the limit of their profitability. So the financial fair play, they're basically spending 20 million more than what they were allowed based off of the profit they're bringing in. So obviously COVID made an impact to that. I mean, with any of these big teams, there's such a monetary value that gets lost or gained if based off of where you finish, if you get relegated, if you get into all these different positions. So, of course, they have huge teams of lawyers, accountants trying to do all this kind of fancy stuff. And so it really comes down to whatever your fancy accountants and lawyers do. Does it hold up in court? And to usually I think it's like a three-person commission that was taking a look at their.
Yeah, and I think only one of them is related to soccer. I think the other one's like a judge, and someone else is like some type of related lawyer or something.
And if you're an accountant or lawyer, or you just really love to nerd out about that kind of stuff, there's so much to unpack and to look into. Some of the stuff that Everton is doing that is well known is obviously they're building a new stadium. So that's a very expensive endeavor. But on top of that, they had some dealings and some naming rights that were already, kind of pen to paper with a Russian oligarch. They had some deals with overseas conglomerates and companies that ended up getting sanctioned. So what that means is that income that's coming in based off of the war in Ukraine, Everton basically had to tear up those contracts and not get that money that they had already kind of put deals in place for. So it's those kind of things that really do kind of hurt you that are unexpected. And that's one of the ways that they tried to fight the ruling, but it doesn't seem like it was very effective.
Yeah, and they have a British Iranian billionaire who I believe Moshiri, who spent a ton of money and put a ton of money into transfers at Everton, pretty much all of which failed. They're probably the only team that spends money worse than Manchester United. They just spent it on the worst players. Like literally their team just got worse, even though they were spending like 100 million a year.
Do you remember that season they bought like 6 number 10s with like Gylfi Sigurdsson? And I think they brought in, this was like Rooney when he was like a corpse of himself. It was the most ridiculous signings ever.
Their transfer strategy has just been so bad for so long. All of this was coming where they were just kind of sliding down the table every year. I think the reaction to the point deduction in England has been one of kind of extreme sympathy towards Everton. I think people think in general that Everton has been hard done by, kind of this isn't quite fair for them. And part of that, I think one of the things is that apparently they had an official with the Premier League kind of at some point when they knew they were starting to get in a little bit of trouble, they had somebody from the Premier League kind of sign off on all their deals and say, does this fit within the parameters of what were the legal parameters within the Premier League guidelines? And, they were trying to submit everything and be kind of above board. And apparently that wasn't enough for the Premier League. They said, just doing that and that was too little too late or something like that. A lot of people think Everton had a rough go of this. It sounds like there's multiple clubs, especially the clubs that have been relegated within the last year or two, that are almost considering suing Everton in the Premier League, because when you get relegated from the Premier League, obviously that's a huge, massive blow to your finances of your club. You may never get back to the Premier League, for 30 years if you go down. So, and the money that you get from TV rights between the Championship and the Premier League is absolutely massive. So those teams that were relegated, whether or not you think that extra 20 million or whatever they spent is what actually kept Everton up, I don't think it is. But you could argue that, maybe it's weird that they basically committed the quote unquote crime 2 years ago. It affected the teams that got relegated 2 years ago, and their punishment is this year they get the point deduction.
Yeah, it's almost too little too late. And it seems, I think it's kind of goes into the equation, probably at least a little bit, whether the Premier League would, admit it or not. But it's to kind of deter teams in the future from doing and breaching FFP because they just want to make sure that it's not worth the risk of getting caught to stay up and, kind of keep those rights. But I think what you said about a little bit of the Premier League rallying around a team that obviously at some level committed probably some sort of breach of FFP, but it seems like fans in the league are rallying around them because Manchester City has about 115 charges that have been filed against them over the last few seasons on breaching some of financial fair play.
And let me be clear, I've not read through all of those charges, and I am not an expert in any of these things. And they are not the same charges that Everton, I don't think, was accused of. I think a lot of these charges were essentially based on whether or not the funding that they had, especially in the early years, in the 2012 time frame, was that funding all above board, or did they kind of get extra money by using their owners' airlines and other things in other companies in the UAE to funnel money into Manchester City that then allowed them to spend more money because they were pumping up their revenue artificially. So, you know, I'm not going to pretend to really know what's going on. It sounds like City fans and City kind of people think that this is something that will go away. Famously, the UEFA, I believe, had charged Manchester City with financial issues and found them guilty. And then they basically went to like the Supreme Court of Sports in Europe, and they basically overturned the charges. But I think in part that was due to a technicality that I think statute of limitations had gone or something like that. It all gets very murky at the top, and City can obviously afford the best lawyers in the entire world. So it sounds like they've set maybe a date, 2024, or I think it might even be 2025 when they're going to try to adjudicate these claims and figure out what the penalty would be for Manchester City if there is a penalty. My suspicion is always going to be that City is not going to get punished for these things. But the thing is if they are found guilty for this, given how heavy-handed the Premier League was with the punishment against Everton, if they find City guilty of, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 charges, what penalty could possibly be acceptable for them? I mean, you're almost talking like relegation, vacating titles, kind of crazy stuff that we've never really seen. And that would obviously send incredible shockwaves, not only through the Premier League, but through world soccer as a whole. I'm sure this is not something that is going to, either way. I think Manchester City fans, if something terrible, if the worst of the worst happens to their club, then obviously they're going to say that things were biased and set up against them. And if nothing happens to Manchester City, every other team's fans are basically going to say, everyone's biased towards Manchester City and they can just afford the best lawyers and get off and do whatever they want because they're rich. So I don't know. It's kind of messy days ahead, I think, in this regard.
Who's the Kevin De Bruyne of lawyers that City has signed? That's really what I want to know. Who's the Pep?
You need Kardashian,
Get a Kardashian in
You
there.
get OJ Simpson's lawyers in there.
Yeah, maybe if Kim passes the California bar, she can go over there and start defending the sovereign state of Manchester City.
But you got to wear a wig or something for like judicial practices in the UK or something. But anyway, all of this, Chelsea also freely admitted some of their own crimes, which is interesting. So we'll see if they get penalized. I think they had some issues with agent fees and things like this. Again, all of these crimes.
Does Chelsea have like the Frank Lampard of lawyers over there as a manager? Is that the parallel that we have there, admitting the stuff that they're doing?
Fat Frank over there just, they'd have Frank from Always Sunny probably. No, they can afford the best lawyers in the world too. So if City's lawyers end up being successful, I'm pretty sure that they'd get a call from.
Yeah, but Chelsea has young lawyers, fresh out of law school, building up their resume.
They got the potential, guys.
Exactly. In 10 years, man, they're getting away with so many charges.
All right, so let's go into, that was a lot of talking about the Premier League, but not talking about the soccer. So let's talk a little bit about what the season has brought us so far. So we'll start with a couple things. What is one of the best signings that you can think of for any team in the Premier League this year?
I'm going to be biased, but I really do think James Maddison has been one of, if not the best signing from this offseason. I think just look how Spurs have looked since he has kind of picked up a long-term ankle injury. They just look so much less dangerous. He was the kind of creative driving force into helping them create all of these chances. And I think everybody did think James Madison was a pretty good player. But I think after, his form for the first probably 10 or so games, folks are, thinking he is one of the best midfielders in the league and a definite mainstay in the English national team if he's healthy. Same question over to you.
I'm going to stick at the top as well and just go Jeremy Doku. He's essentially completely replaced Jack Grealish and has already integrated himself into, I think, Pep Guardiola's starting 11, which is very difficult to do. I think most attacking players that come into Manchester City's squad usually take a year to kind of settle in, but he already looks electric. He adds a different dynamic as kind of a dribbler who's willing to take people on. Uh, and him combined with Holland, I think, makes City's attack just even more devastating than it was. And he's really been electric and someone that I think not, he was a good young player and kind of flew under the radar, I think, of the other top clubs, but it just goes to show you that Manchester City's transfer infrastructure is second to none. And so on another note, what's the biggest surprise for you, whether that's a team or a player in the Premier League this year?
I think a biggest surprise for, say, this is probably not for everybody, but more just kind of how I looked at the season coming into it is how kind of vulnerable City look. And I'm saying vulnerable as far as Manchester City is, but for whatever reason, right now, they don't look like they are the killers they usually are. And of course, they usually tend to pick up steam and speed as the year goes on. But at least right now, they are, kind of giving away games and dropping points that in other years you never would have guessed for them to do. So, I do believe in Pep, and I really do hope if it can't be Spurs, it must be City to make sure that Arsenal can't kind of clinch that Premier League title that they've been chasing for years and years and years. But yeah, City just kind of looks a little bit vulnerable this year.
I think to me, Tottenham is the biggest surprise, and I think this Tottenham is not going to end the season well because I think the injuries have just caught up with them already, and so I think it's derailed their train. But Tottenham and Ange Postecoglou has made an imprint on the Premier League that I think very few people saw coming. I think he won 3 straight Manager of the Month awards, which is kind of crazy. They were leading the league for a little bit, and they've just brought a kind of freshness. An all-out attacking approach is kind of just like, we will throw everything at you and dare you to outscore us. And most of the time, teams can't outscore them. And it's crazy just how successful they've been with that approach. I do worry about the long-term sustainability of that. And now that they do have injuries, it's hard to see Tottenham really kind of pushing on. But at the same time, I think it's been a breath of fresh air and shows you, even if in a team that's losing Harry Kane, basically the best player in the Premier League, or one of them, you can still have a complete change of ideas, and sometimes changing the manager can change the fortunes of a club. And on the opposite side of things, what has not surprised you about this season?
One of the things that's not surprised me is going to be the bottom teams, bar Wolves, who I think I did have in the relegation spots, which I think it was a mistake with how good Hwang Hee-chan has kind of been looking this year. But as far as the teams that came up from the championship last year, it looks like all of them are outclassed by the Premier League. They don't look like they have a real shot at staying up. And I think that's one of the biggest things that Everton has going for them this year is in previous years, a 10-point deduction would have been the nail in the coffin and Everton would have almost for sure been relegated. But this year, I think those 3 teams are looking pretty terrible as far as Sheffield, Luton, and Burnley. I think Sheffield actually just sacked Heckingbottom for being the first manager to be sacked this year. And so it does seem like those 3 coming up, no surprise that they're going to struggle with the strength of this Premier League schedule.
For me, it's kind of been Chelsea, where I think everybody kind of feels a little bit okay about them. It feels like they have good potential, but they're just not actually scoring goals, and it's kind of the same problem they had before, and I think we knew that this was probably going to happen where they play great soccer, they have tons of young talent, but they just don't have a goal scorer up top yet, and so I think at some point, obviously, with the money that they spend, they will find that, and this I think most people think that this team will just rocket up the table at that point. This season, I think, is also gonna be a write-off where it's difficult to imagine them getting top 4, but I think it's hard to imagine them not clicking into gear probably some point this year and really starting to turn things up and really start, you know, climbing the mountain to where they wanna end up.
If you just let XG equal goals, man, they'd be doing phenomenal.
XG is such a basic stat. I mean, just getting shots away does not mean chance creation. But anyway, that's why soccer stats are just are rough.
This now kind of takes us to your new top six. If you had to make the prediction for this year, and then on top of that, out of that top six, who do you have in the title race?
So just to start with the title race and get those guys out of the way, because I think most people are going to have City, Arsenal, and Liverpool as the three teams at the top. It is, I think, interesting for the neutral to see that Liverpool has returned to form after a really off season last year. Mo Salah is still in great form. Their attack is in great form, and it looks like Van Dijk and Trent Alexander-Arnold have really recovered their form and are playing, as well as they have, I think, for a long time. Their midfield has been solidified by a lot of the summer purchases they made. And Klopp is just Klopp, and he's just one of the best managers in the world. So Liverpool knows how to win. They've been there before. It's hard to imagine them not being in and around the top. I don't think they quite can hit the highs of Manchester City. And I think Manchester City are still going to be the favorites. They're doing all of this without, their probably second best player in Kevin De Bruyne. Some might even say their best player. The fact that they can just, lose a guy it'd be like Liverpool losing, Mo Salah or Arsenal losing Saka. And it's barely, nobody even talks about De Bruyne because they don't even need him. It's kind of crazy how strong their team is. And City, I think, just like a lot of the old, great Premier League teams, really turns it up at the end of the season. It would not surprise me for them to go on a 12-win run to kind of close out the year and reclaim the top spot in the Premier League. But Arsenal is interesting too because they're actually not playing that well. It doesn't seem like they have this really good trait about them where they're just scoring late goal after late goal, including a goal recently against Luton Town to win. It just doesn't seem like they're kind of fragile at the back sometimes, and it also doesn't seem like they're playing quite as free-flowing soccer as they were last year. But at the same time, they're still in first place right now. So they're at the top of the Premier League. So you have to absolutely take them seriously. I think they're riding their luck a bit. Because obviously it's good to score 90 plus 5-minute goals. It's great for the morale. It's great for the fans. Those are the moments you live for in soccer, but those are not necessarily the things that are sustainable over the course of a 38-game season. And I just don't quite see them on the level really of City, definitely, and probably Liverpool as well. So if I had to predict, I think City's going to win it, and then Liverpool, and I think Arsenal will have a period where their luck kind of runs out.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, saying those are the moments you live for, but you also have to think of, especially fixtures around this time of year, they come, pretty hot and heavy with how many games you have. And playing games to the 95th minute and having to push and, run your body to the ground really does, kind of take a toll on your body. And those are things that you kind of see kind of come back to bite you later in the year.
And if you've never watched the Premier League before, the winter schedule is absolutely insane. Like literally every 3 days, they're playing games. And these are games that are obviously very important to the rest of the year. And if you go through a bad step, have a few bad injuries, if you lose a guy for 3 weeks at this period, you might miss 6 games. Like that's crazy. Whereas, in a normal part of the season, you might only miss 3. So this is a time of year that is always really important. And I think you get a better picture of where people are going to end up kind of a week or two into the new year.
Yeah, I think it's something that people don't talk about enough is just the momentum periods and how important they are. Because, soccer is so different. There's no playoff system. And obviously in a lot of American sports or sports with playoffs, It makes a big difference if you can kind of get hot during playoffs, but it really matters for soccer too, because if your team is super in form in the beginning of the year, that's great. You had 4 games that you looked phenomenal in, and then you run into an international break, and you kind of lose a little bit of that momentum. Some of your players, maybe go away and come back injured. So being able to hit the strides and hit your form in the busy periods goes such a long way, and really does make a big difference in the title race. And I agree, those are the 3 teams that I have in the title race.
So if we agree there, who do you think is kind of going to fill the Champions League places, which this year might be fourth and fifth place, and then kind of the Europa League would be sixth and seventh?
Yeah, so I think I have it going to be City, Arsenal, Liverpool in first, second, and third. Then I actually have Spurs going to sit in there in the fourth place spot. I think Newcastle is going to slot in that fifth just because of the injuries that they already have. But the advantage Spurs have is smartly got themselves out of a domestic cup and smartly finished outside of European slots last year, so they don't have to worry about those stupid competitions.
Completely intended.
Yeah, yeah, that's smart management right there. And so Newcastle, on the other hand, does have to kind of contest with those competitions. So I think that'll kind of get them in the legs. And then finally, I think Villa, who just look very, very good under Emery. I will say they haven't really gone and had a period of injuries like Spurs and Newcastle and some of the other teams have had. So I do think if and when they do run into those periods, it's really going to kind of slow the momentum down. But they do look very, very good. And then finally, I think United. United's been a weird team this year, squeaking out a lot of 1-0 wins. But I do think they're obviously a good enough squad to get it done and at least get into those European positions.
So I think Newcastle will probably finish fourth. I think their team is really good. The only thing that can hold them back is the injuries, which they've already had quite a few of, but their starting 11 is very high quality. Um, and with Ishak and Bruno Guimaraes and Joel Linton, that is just such a solid core. So I think Newcastle finishes fourth. I think Villa falls off hard. My interesting prediction is I think fifth is going to go to Chelsea. I think Chelsea is really going to storm up the table the second half of the year. I think they're already a good team, and I think they will really develop into a team that's going to be one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the second half of the year. The fact that they're behind a little bit right now means that they'll only kind of finish fifth, but I think they're going to make a strong push and show you why they spent all this money on these young players. And then after that, Spurs probably I would have 6. I do really like this Spurs team. I do like Ange. It's one of those kind of ideas where I really think he is a good manager, and he may completely prove me wrong, but I just wonder about when teams start figuring out how to play against his style a little bit better, because it does seem like they're still catching everybody off guard. But the second time teams play against them in the second half of the year, will that change at all? Maybe not. But I think this winter period is going to be really hard on Spurs because they are just missing a lot of players. And Madison, like you said, has been so integral to their attack. They just they're missing multiple key players up into the new year, and by the time the new year rolls around, we're going to have another 7 games or so played. So I think they'll fall off a little bit, but I think they have a lot of potential to prove me wrong. And then I think United, Villa, probably even Brighton competing for that 7th spot. United, I think they're not drawing any games, and so it actually makes their point total pretty decent. They're really only, I think, 2 points behind Newcastle when at the time of publishing this, only 3 points behind Spurs, which if you would just reading the papers and everything of how much crisis they're in and Eric Ten Hag losing the dressing room, all this craziness, you'd think that they were in 14th place or something, but, the team has played worse than their point total this year. And there's nothing really that makes me think that that's going to change. They do have good players. It's just not working so far this year. And so maybe that changes that, when you think about how long a soccer season is, right? August till May, 10 months basically. So things can change quite a bit, and there's a lot of years when teams are written off in the first half of the year and they come back in the second half of the year, something just clicks. And I think that's always possible, but I'd probably have United sitting somewhere in 7th even. So, in Villa and Brighton kind of right around there. Would love to be proven wrong, and we'll see what happens and see if any of these teams are really. I think a lot of the teams are just a couple key injuries away from really falling off because even though the bottom teams in the Premier League are not very good, I think the middle teams in the Premier League are all pretty decent, and you actually have to be on your game to really take points from them. And there's just a lot of teams at the top end of the table. You know, there's probably 8, 9, 10 teams that all think that they can win most of the games that they play. So there's not as many free games. Well, there actually are kind of a couple free games, but outside of those bottom teams, there's not very many easy games anymore.
No, I think it's well said. Just win the games you're supposed to. If you just don't draw for the whole year, I mean, it goes a really, really long way in your point total. So I think that kind of wraps it up for this episode. Thanks so much for taking a listen for us. As always, feel free to follow us on socials. Relatively active on Instagram. I think we have a Twitter or an X or whatever the hell we're calling it now out there. But we are kind of trying to push a little bit more of that content out there. So thank you for sticking with us. As always, feel free to share the show with your friends, whoever, so we can kind of get the word out there and we can become part of the media. So we can also have these terrible takes and influence the Premier League in one way or the other.
That's the dream. Signing off. See ya.